So my book is at once a memoir, a love story, and sort of a guided tour of the Talmud, you might say. And the book had its genesis about 15 years ago, when I was going through a really difficult time in my life. I was getting divorced. I was living alone in Jerusalem, thousands of miles from my family and closest friends who were back in New York, where I grew up. And I was very, very depressed. I remember thinking that time stretched ahead of me inexorably, and that with every passing day, I was just getting one day older. And the only thing that really got me out of bed in the mornings was that I had this friend I used to go jogging with early in the morning. And one day, my friend mentioned to me that she had started learning Daf Yomi, and she suggested that I try it too. Now I remember I looked at her like she was crazy. I had heard of Daf Yomi. I knew that it was an international program to learn the entire Babylonian Talmud in 7.5 years at the rate of 1 page a day. But 7.5 years, I mean, the notion was inconceivable. My marriage had just fallen apart. I was in no position to make any long-term commitments. I wouldn't even sign like a rental agreement, a contract for an apartment for more than 6 months, because I wasn't even sure I was still going to be in Israel, where what was going on in my life. Everything felt so uncertain. And also, I couldn't imagine wanting to study all that Talmud. I had grown up in a traditional home. I went to a Jewish day school where I had studied some Talmud before. But I thought of the Talmud as a dry legal code with a complicated, convoluted logic. I was very put off by what I perceived to be the misogyny of the rabbis in the Talmud. Most of the women who are mentioned in the Talmud are either some rabbi's wife or daughter, right? Very few of the women have independent identities. And I also thought, the sheer massiveness of the text, like a text that would take 7.5 years to learn. Like the Babylonian Talmud consists of 2,700 pages. Those pages are divided into 37 masechtot volumes. Here, I happen to have one right here on my desk. I was just working. All of those masechtot are further divided into chapters. And as I was thinking about all this, my friend stopped me and she said something I never forgot. She said, "Ilana, you're feeling completely stuck right now. Don't you think if every day you learned 1 page of Talmud, maybe eventually a new chapter would start for you?" And I thought about that. I thought, wow, that's interesting. If every day I learned 1 page of Talmud, then with every passing day, I wouldn't just be one day older, I'd be one day wiser. And I came to appreciate that this is really the Jewish view of time. The rabbis teach in Pirkei Avot, in a part of the Mishnah, generally known as the Ethics of the Fathers, that's how it's called. The rabbis say that when you're 5, you're supposed to begin studying Bible. When you're 10, you begin studying Mishnah. When you're 15, you begin studying Talmud, and the list goes on. At that point in my life, I was nearly twice the age for studying Talmud. But as we read elsewhere in that same text, if not now, when? And so I decided, okay, you know what? I'm just going to give this a try because things can't get any worse for me right now. I can't feel any worse, let's put it that way. And I thought to myself, maybe if I start this program of learning a page of Talmud a day, then the pull of this schedule will kind of help me move forwards, almost like being on a treadmill where you have to move forwards in spite of yourself. So what I discovered about the Talmud really surprised me. It wasn't what I expected at all. Unlike later works that followed from it, the Talmud it's not a law code that tells Jews how to behave. It's really more of a record of conversations among the rabbis in which many of the questions are left open and unresolved. And unlike the Talmud I had studied in the Jewish day school I attended through the 8th grade, a Salmon Schechter school, maybe you've heard of that school, we were always given, my junior high school, like we were given source sheets with quoted passages cut and pasted, but studying Talmud in context was a completely different experience. I was working at the time as an editor. And so in my day job, I was always thinking about questions of structure and literary coherence. And it was fascinating for me to just watch how the stream of rabbinic consciousness unfolded associatively rather than rationally. And yes, there were topics I found more interesting than others, but I just really enjoyed sort of being carried along for the ride. And became very clear to me how much I was being transformed by the Talmud I was studying. When I first began learning, it was very solitary. I would just study alone in my studio apartment, listening to, I guess there weren't even podcasts then. I think I was listening to like, audio recorded classes on my computer. I don't even think I had a phone that enabled me to do it. Just to give you some context here, how much has changed. There's a line in the Talmud in Tractate Eruvin. The rabbis say, that if someone is walking along their way and they have no companion, they should study Torah. And that's kind of what happened for me. Studying Talmud became my companion during what was otherwise a very lonely stretch of life. But I soon realized that Daf Yomi is never really solitary because tens of thousands of people learn Daf Yomi worldwide, and they're all quite literally on the same page. And basically this program has been going on for now almost a century, since 1923, this program of learning a page of Talmud a day. The Talmud itself dates back to the first centuries of the Common Era, but this practice of learning Talmud every day, according to the schedule, began in 1923 in Lublin with Rabbi Meir Shapira. I began to start thinking of Daf Yomi as sort of like the world's largest book club. And so even when I was learning alone at home, I was essentially inhabiting this enormous virtual classroom in which sitting ahead of me were rows and rows of scholars who'd studied that same page of Talmud in generations before me. And further along in my row were other students of Talmud elsewhere in Jerusalem, in London, in Manhattan, in Melbourne, right, all over the world. And when I realized that, I thought to myself, okay, Ilana, you're living in the global capital of Jewish learning. Like, get yourself to a Daf Yomi class. And I did. I found a class that welcomed me. I was the only woman in the class. I think I brought down the average age by about 30 years. I was also the only person who took notes. I scribbled fast and furiously in the margins of my volumes of Talmud. I noted anything, lines I wanted to remember, explanations offered by the rabbi who was teaching the class. I would summarize the arguments under discussion. I remember that the other men in the class, I can even show you, like every volume of Talmud I have is like full of, here, I don't know, I'm very bad with the camera here, but you can kind of see it's like full of annotations. This is actually the first tractate I ever learned, and we're now on it again in the cycle. I'm on starting my third cycle. But anyway, I would sit in this class and I would take tons of notes, and the other men in the class would sort of make fun of me and say, why are you writing in pencil? Maybe one day you want to publish all your notes. And I had no idea how prescient they were, because that is in fact what I ended up doing. Because what ended up happening was, the more I learned, the more I realized this is sort of something funny about Jewish learning, that the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know and how much more you have to learn. So that Daf Yomi class inspired me to join other classes. I started going to a weekly class on the Torah portion. In that class, I met the man I went on to marry, and he started learning Daf Yomi too. And while we were dating, we would learn together. We would make pasta and with tomato sauce while we were learning, and try not to drip tomato sauce on the passages in the Talmud about the blood on the temple altar. And there were all these sorts of interconnections between life and learning. And I would find myself, I just couldn't help. I always wanted to write about what was happening in my learning. I've always kept journals. And now in my journals, I found myself increasingly writing about the page of Talmud I was studying. And it really began to feel like, I wasn't just following the Talmud, but really the Talmud was following me through all the twists and turns my life was taking. Divorce, making Aliyah, officially making my home in Israel, dating, marriage, pregnancy, motherhood, all of which really unfolded against the backdrop of the page of Talmud I was studying. I think of a line from T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I have measured my life in coffee spoons. I really think I've measured my life in pages of Talmud learned. I remember various tractates of the Talmud based on where I was in my life when I learned them. And I associate periods in my life with whatever it was I was learning. And all throughout, I was always taking notes. In fact, when I run out of space in the margins of my volume of Talmud, I started an anonymous blog where I would write about the pages of Talmud I was studying, journal entries, what have you. And I found that the events of my personal life really served to illuminate the text and make an argument for a way of reading the text in which the text is commentary on life and life is commentary on the text. And all of this writing eventually became the book that I published. My memoir, love story, introduction to the Talmud, which is called If All the Seas Were Ink. Okay, so if you look at a page of Talmud, you'll find in the middle of the page is the text of the Mishnah, which is the oldest parts of the Talmud. Actually, oh, here, let me hold on one second. I'll show you. Okay, so the Mishnah is in the center of the page, and with the Gemara, with the rabbinic commentary, and that's surrounded by later commentators, like the medieval commentaries of Rashi, other medieval commentators. And the later on you get in history, right, the more you get relegated to the margins. That's sort of how the Talmud is, the camera wrong, but how the Talmud has been traditionally printed for the last few centuries. For as long as I've been learning, as I said, I've been annotating my volumes of Talmud, writing in whatever little white space is left in the edges of on the edges of the page. And so in my head, I kind of imagine that the page of Talmud is ever expanding. And as more and more scholars and readers of the text add their comments, we get more and more commentary on the text, because that's really the nature of Torah shebe'al peh, as it's known, the oral Torah. It invites us to respond, right? You have to insert yourself into the rabbinic conversations because there's so many missing pieces, so many rough edges, and you as a reader and as a student of Talmud, your job is to try to make sense of the text, to try to smooth those edges, to try to make the different opinions fit together. Disagreement is the engine of the Talmud, right? That's what makes the Talmud run, and the pieces don't completely cohere and don't fit together, and that's your job as a reader. Now, when I found myself studying Talmud, as I said, I really often found that the text was speaking to aspects of my experience in my life. And so my commentaries tended to be very personal, and in that sense, perhaps different from the way the Talmud has traditionally been read. But I really think that to engage deeply with the text, to engage deeply with Torah, it really requires this kind of personal connection. There's a statement by Rabbi Yossi in Tractate Sota. He says, "Ein divrei Torah mitkaimin ela b'misha ma'amid atzmo arom alehem." That words of Torah only take root or establish themselves in someone who makes himself or herself naked before them. And Rabbi Yossi, his statement is generally understood as meaning that if you want to learn Torah deeply and fully, you have to, strip yourself of preconceived notions, let's say, and sort of start, with a blank slate. But I read him differently. I think what he's saying, or maybe what he's also saying, is that the most meaningful way to study Talmud is to search for the interconnections between what you're learning and the rest of your reading and living and learning. You can't study Torah in a vacuum. And by Torah, I mean all Jewish texts, Talmud included. I'm sort of using those terms interchangeably. So I think of Rabbi Yossi's statement as implying that to learn Torah, you have to be willing to bare your soul. You have to make yourself vulnerable. You have to summon the courage to let the text resonate in the darkest and deepest recesses of your soul, in the hope that your soul will illuminate the text and the text will illuminate your soul. So yes, in a way, my book is different from traditional commentaries because I really bared a lot of my soul in my book, in sharing my personal journey, both the darker moments and the moments filled with light and hope. But I hope that the fact that I did this, that I did share so much that was so personal in my book, I hope it will inspire others to read their lives into the text of our tradition and to find a place for these texts in their lives. So the Talmud is a text that dates back to the early centuries of the Common Era, so about 2,000 years old, and it definitely bears the traces of its time. You'd be very hard-pressed to find anyone today who would try to use, I don't know, Talmudic remedies to cure illness, say, or recite Talmudic incantations against demons, right? But for me, these historical curiosities they really draw me to the text, because I find they give me a window into the larger worldview and milieu of the rabbinic sages. I don't think of the Talmud as a timeless text. I think of it very much as the product of its times. I have no expectation that its wisdom, that all of its wisdom will be timeless. But I do have tremendous respect for the rabbis' creativity, for their imagination, especially when it came to the way they read and interpreted the Bible. I think their wildly creative and imaginative biblical readings sort of paved the way for us to read the Bible creatively, and in some ways freely. And I find myself, when I teach and when I write, really seeing it as my mission to help other people appreciate the rabbinic imagination. And it's also, I should say, it's not limited to how the rabbis read the Bible. It's also how they conjured for themselves, how they reconstructed the world of the temple, which had been destroyed just centuries earlier, but still felt so important religiously to the rabbis. And the tractates of the Talmud that are about the inner workings of the temple are among the tractates most fascinating to me, because I really feel like we're getting a glimpse of a world that we otherwise would not have this access to. It's in a way, it's really more a glimpse of the rabbinic world than of the world of the temple, because it's really how the rabbis imagined something that was lost to them, and also how they understood loss and trauma, which in itself is very instructive. One of my favorite stories in the Talmud is about a conversation between a Talmudic sage, Rabbi Joshua ben Hanania, as he's known, and the daughter of the Roman emperor. And you read stories like this in the Talmud, and you have to ask, like, okay, really, come on, like, were the rabbis really, really like buddy with the highest echelons of Roman society? Like, doubtful, right? Very doubtful, right? But I'm not reading the story for its historical veracity. I read it for the insights I can glean from it. Anyway, okay, so I should go back to the story. So in this story, right, Rabbi Joshua, who by the way, we know he was a very ugly rabbi. We know that from other stories about him. And the daughter of the Roman emperor took one look at him, and she said, "How can such beautiful wisdom be contained in so ugly a vessel?" And Rabbi Joshua, the ugly vessel for beautiful Torah, came back at her with a question of his own. He said to her, "Okay, well, your father, the emperor, does he store his wine in clay vessels?" And the daughter of the emperor said, "Well, yes, of course, doesn't everyone?" And he said, "Yeah, but your father's the emperor. Shouldn't he store his wine in the finest gold vessels?" And she acknowledged that he had a point. She transferred all the imperial stores of wine into gold vessels, and of course it spoiled. Now, I love this story because for me, it really speaks to the relationship between who we are and what we learn. We're all vessels for the Torah that we study, and the Torah that we study fills us and assumes our shape, just in the way that, just like wine and really all liquids take the shape of their containers. And there's some sort of chemical reaction that takes place between who we are and what we learn, whereby we're transformed by the texts we study, and the texts we study are transformed by our encounter with them. I don't think we have to agree with everything that we read or with everything that we learn, whether in the Talmud or in any other text, but we do have to remain receptive. We have to allow our reading and our learning to shape us, and also to be shaped by us. So I'm not sure if my book offers a feminist reading of the Talmudic text. I know it's my reading, and I am a Jewish woman and a feminist. That much I know. I can tell you that as I've studied Daf Yomi in recent years, against the backdrop of life with crying babies and then rowdy toddlers, strong-willed preschoolers, and now increasingly literate and inquisitive school children. My oldest is now 10. In the book, he was just born. I've discovered that passages in the Talmud that have nothing to do about parenting or motherhood have really taken on new meaning for me. So I remember one time that I looked up from my volume of Talmud to find my twin daughters, who were then 18 months. And they were rubbing strawberry yogurt in each other's hair. And at the time, I was learning a passage in Tractate Psachim, which was about the belief that anything that comes in pairs is associated with demonic forces. It comes up when the rabbis are asking whether you can drink 4 cups of wine on Passover because 4 is an even number and it might invite the demons. Anyway, I looked up and saw my girls with this rubbing yogurt in their hair, and I was like, maybe the rabbis are onto something. Maybe pairs, maybe twins are demonic, right? Or I don't know. There's so many examples I could give. I remember one time my son lost his stuffed elephant, this doll that he took to him every day to preschool. And when we couldn't find it, we bought him another one. And then a few weeks later, his teacher found the original elephant. And my son was so bewildered, like, there's only one elephant. What does this mean? How are there 2? And that became for me the way I understood the concept of a korban tamura, which is when you have a sacrifice and the sacrificial animal gets lost before you slaughter it, and you have to designate another animal in its stead, but then you find the original animal, which animal is considered sacred, right? The rabbis discuss this at great length. There's a whole tractate of the Talmud about this very topic. And I felt like, well, I understand this thanks to the lost stuffed elephant. Or I'm going to give one more example. So often the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is empty the dishwasher from the day before. And I always think about the rabbis in the temple. The very first ritual that was performed in the morning in the temple was clearing away the ashes from the previous day's sacrifice to clear the altar for that day. It's called Trumat Hadeshin. So I always think of, emptying the dishwasher is sort of the analog of Trumat Hadeshin, and really that all the activities I perform every day for my kids are sort of a version of the Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice offered every day in the temple. Now, I don't know, are these feminist readings? They're my readings as a Jewish woman in the 21st century. I feel very, very, very fortunate to be studying Talmud as a woman at this point in time. When you encounter women in the Talmud, they're generally rather unlikable characters. There are lots of stories in the Talmud about very difficult wives. Rav's wife would aggravate him by preparing, whenever he asked for lentils for dinner, she would make peas, and when he wanted peas, she would make him lentils, the Talmud tells us. Rabbi Yossi Haglili's wife drove him so crazy that he borrowed money so he would be able to afford to divorce her and pay her alimony because he couldn't stand her. Rabbi Tzadok's marriage couldn't have been very good because he was almost seduced by a Roman matron, and various stories like this. And when I read these stories, I have to say, I find it very hard to identify with the women mentioned in them. Even if they weren't really as unpleasant as their husbands made them out to be, they seem to spend most of their time, I don't know, sorting lentils or birthing children, gossiping with other women by the moonlight. When I study Talmud, I find myself identifying far less with the women in the text and more with the men. And I came to realize with time that by the Talmud standards, I'm a man, not a woman. If by man you mean what the rabbis essentially meant, an independent, self-sufficient adult who could own property, who could live, who was free to live. Women had to be living in their father's home or their husband's home. If not, they really had very little recourse. And thank God that is not the case today. And because of that, because I identify so much more with the men in the Talmud, with the rabbis, I am able to regard the gender stereotypes in the Talmud as historical curiosities, not infuriating provocations. The Talmud doesn't offend me because I'm defying its classifications through my very engagement with the text, right? For the rabbis, the notion of a woman studying Talmud would have been inconceivable. And in a way, when I encounter the woman in the Talmud, I sort of just think of them as like an extinct species. And I don't get angry. I just say, oh, okay, they're not around anymore. And thank God, thank God. I feel so lucky that, the Talmud, for generations, it's been plowed through by male scholars who were the ones who were writing those commentaries in the margins. And how wonderful that the Talmud has now become, once again, fertile ground for gleaning new insights. And I'm just so excited to be a part of that. So Daf Yomi has really been a saving grace for me throughout this pandemic. I'm still learning a page of Talmud a day. It's now been about 15 years. I'm a person who needs to feel productive and efficient every day. My mental health really depends on it. There were so many days during this pandemic when I felt like it was impossible to get anything done. And yet every day, no matter what, I managed to learn that day's page of Talmud, even if it meant, that, dinner was tuna fish. Like, I got through that page of Talmud. That was so important to me. And again, I found that the text I was learning was always resonating with my experiences. So right when the pandemic began, we started learning Tractate Shabbat. That's where the Daf Yomi community was that was what the Daf Yomi community was up to. And so really, I started learning the Tractate of the Talmud that's about the day of rest, right? As I gradually realized that people all over the world were being asked to accept upon themselves an extended period of resting, retreating, desisting from ordinary labor. Here in Israel, where I live, our Ministry of Health issued increasingly strict guidelines, like every few days, about the extent to which we were allowed to interact socially, like no gatherings of 100, then no gatherings of 50, no gatherings of 20, no minyanim, and every day the rules were more stringent. And so it was while I was increasingly confined to the private domain of my own home that I learned the first chapter of Tractate Shabbat, which is all about the limits on our interaction with other people, the idea of public domains, private domains, the prohibition on carrying from one domain to another. I realized actually, like, this notion, like the whole opening chapters were all about the prohibition on carrying on Shabbat. And I found myself thinking all the time that every time I left my home, I was potentially carrying germs that could affect those around me. And that anytime I came home, I was potentially bringing home germs that could infect my family. I found myself, always thinking, wow, that I unwittingly might be a carrier, and no amount of hand washing or sanitizing would save the people I loved or the communities I was a part of from contagion. And so 2 months after the pandemic began, right, we've been learning Tractate Shabbat. Maybe it was actually only a month. It's the beginning of Masechet Shabbat. Yeah, there's a story early in Masechet Shabbat in the second chapter about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a second century sage who lived during a time of Roman persecution when it was forbidden to study Torah. He's the rabbi who is buried in Meron, where tragic accident happened recently on Lag BaOmer. In the story in the Talmud about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he and his son flee to the study house to learn, because you're not allowed to study Torah in any public space. But soon Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai begins to worry that maybe his wife will betray them. He says, Nashim da'atan kala alehan, women are lightheaded and frivolous, we can't trust them. So he takes his son and they go to a cave without telling anyone else. And for 12 years, they study Torah in secret. And there are several really strange and puzzling aspects of the story. Like when they're in the cave, they shed all their clothes and sit there buried up to their necks in sand, like talking heads. God creates a miracle for them, a carob tree, a spring of water that supply all their nutritional needs. And when 12 years pass, they come out of the cave. And they see that the light of the outside world is bright and blinding. They see people running back and forth, going about their daily business, and they think to themselves, what is this? Like, what could possibly be more important than studying Torah? And they actually end up going back to the cave. They're not quite ready to come out yet and studying for another year. And Rabbi Shimon says to his son, the world is enough with me and with you. Like, we are sufficient to constitute the world. And the reason I'm sharing this story with you is because now that I've learned 2 full cycles of Daf Yomi, I encountered the story twice in my Daf Yomi study. The first time was, I can tell you, it must have been 8 years ago now, because my twins are now 8. It was right when I had come home from the hospital after the twins were born, my twin girls. It was the dead of winter, so I almost never left the house. I didn't bother to get dressed. I just wore the same sweatpants every day. I remember thinking that I was essentially buried up to my neck in sand, like Shimon Bar Yochai and his son. My life consisted of an endless cycle of, changing diapers and breastfeeding, and also, of course, trying to keep up with Daf Yomi. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, so I'm kind of like the carob tree and the spring of water and the study partner all rolled up into one. And when, like, on occasion, I would take the twins outside for a walk, I would see people like running to catch a bus or get to work on time. And I would think to myself, what are these people running to? Like, what could be so important? And for me too, the light of the outside world was blinding. And then I would come home and unbundle the twins, and I would look at them and I would say the same words that Rabbi Shimon said to his son: the world is enough with me and with you. Anyway, that was my first encounter with the story. And then I came to it again, as I said, a year ago, in Daf Yomi, a little over a year ago now, probably about February, March of last year. And this time I again identified with the rabbi in the story, but for a different reason, because I was holed up at home with my family members, not on maternity leave, but in the middle of a global pandemic. I just like Bar Yochai's world contracted into the space of the cave. My whole world seemed to contract into the space of our Jerusalem apartment. And the carob tree, the spring of water that miraculously furnished Bar Yochai and his son with all their food. I guess the equivalent for us was that we started getting our food in new ways. Instead of going out to the supermarket, everything we needed miraculously appeared on our doorstep. At least I think that's how it looked to my kids, right? They didn't see us typing in the credit card information or whatever. My kids and I spent a lot of time together, like Bar Yochai and his son. Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's been a strange existence. But I do, when I would look at our Shabbat table and week after week, it was just our family. There was something very special about that. There was a way in which, we were enough to constitute our world, or we learned to be enough. So anyway, I will always associate that story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai with the two times I've encountered it in Daf Yomi, my maternity leave and the pandemic. And during a period this past year when so much of life has felt, so much of our sense of time has felt upended, I've been very grateful to have Daf Yomi as an anchor, maybe even a life raft. Yeah. I have to say, I don't think of myself as a writer. In my book, I write about the Talmud's distinction between two kind of Levites who served in the temple, members of the tribe of Levi. There was one group known as the Mishoarim, the gatekeepers, and another known as the Mishorarim, the poets. They're supposed to sound very similar. The gatekeepers were responsible for locking the gates in the temple and other administrative tasks, whereas the poets were responsible for the vocal music sung in the temple. And I've thought a lot about this distinction. I write about it in my book. I think the poet is meant to be creative, original. The poet's work is one of a kind, right? No one else will sing in the same way as that any particular Levite will sing. No one will sing the exact same thing. But on the other hand, the gatekeeper's work is important because of its precision, and for just the opposite reason, right? Its reliability, its replicability, right? Anyone would have to lock the gates in the exact same way. You don't want people being creative about how they're locking the temple. All my life, I've thought of myself as a gatekeeper. I've worked for decades in book publishing. As a literary agent, my job was to be a gatekeeper for literature, responsible for what books would be translated into Hebrew and by whom. I've also worked as an editor, helping other people with their writing. I work now as a translator. Actually, right before we spoke, I was working on the novel. I'm translating a novel from Hebrew to English. And yes, I've always been a poet too, that is to say a writer. Well, I write poetry also, but yeah, and under the radar. But always that was something I thought of that I did on the side. I will say that since the publication of my book, I've tried to allow myself to devote more time to writing. It really doesn't come easy for me. I think temperamentally, I am much more suited to being a gatekeeper than a poet. I much more enjoy helping other people with their writing. I love translating. I love editing. But I'm working on it. Let's just say it's an ongoing project.